The wind swept across the sun-scorched streets of Dry Creek, carrying dust and the faint scent of horse sweat and leather. A quiet weight pressed on the small frontier town, as if the horizon itself was holding its breath. The saloon's piano tinkled softly. The wind swept across the sun-scorched streets of Dry Creek, carrying dust and the faint scent of horse sweat and leather. A quiet weight pressed on the small frontier town, as if the horizon itself was holding its breath. The saloon's piano tinkled softly. No one noticed the stranger at first. He rode slowly over the ridge, a lone figure hunched over a lean horse. The wide brim of his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much and survived too many nights. When he entered the town, his steps were measured, deliberate, each hoofbeat and footfall carrying the weight of a story that refused to be forgotten. He approached the water trough, tying his horse with careful precision, and spoke simply, quietly, but with a presence that demanded attention. "I need water." The town froze. Windows shuttered. Windows shuttered. Doors half open stopped swinging. Whispers traveled like wildfire through the streets, men and women clutching children, shopkeepers gripping their counters. All hearts holding their breath at a name that hovered on the wind before it was spoken. Aaron Whitlock. It had been 10 years since anyone had seen him. 10 years since the Bitter Creek Ranch fire took lives, reputations, and left behind ugly rumors of theft and betrayal. And now, here he was, asking for the simplest thing: water. An elderly woman brought a bucket, her hands trembling. He accepted it with a faint, sad smile, the kind of smile that carries apologies for wrongs he did not commit and grief for what he had witnessed. Sheriff Callahan, a man broad of shoulder and patient in gaze, leaned against the post of his office. His hand hovered near the revolver at his hip, though his eyes betrayed more curiosity than fear. He had heard the stories, the whispered rumors of Aaron Whitlock, and now, standing before him was the man himself, unbroken yet weathered by the years. "Aaron Whitlock," the sheriff said quietly, his voice low, measured, and heavy with the memory of what had happened. "I didn't expect to see you again." Aaron lifted his gaze, meeting the sheriff's eyes with a calm that only experience and loss can forge. "I don't expect to be welcomed," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. "I only came to find something that was lost." The sheriff's expression tightened. "Many things were lost that night," he said, "and some may never be found." Aaron's eyes roamed the quiet town to the boarded-up windows, the empty street, the dusty storefronts, and then back to the sheriff. "Then perhaps it's time they were," he replied, his voice carrying a determination tempered with sorrow. The wind shifted, tossing dust, papers, and unspoken tension through the streets. From doorways, alleyways, and porches, townspeople watched silently, hearts pounding, eyes wide, waiting to see what would unfold. They were realizing that the past had arrived before the stranger even spoke again. Aaron stepped forward, unarmed but commanding, his voice low yet carrying across the square. "I'm not here for vengeance," he declared, "but the truth must be faced." The words settled on the town like dust in sunlight, heavy, unavoidable. And just as the first stirrings of fear and hope collided in the hearts of the onlookers, a distant rider burst over the ridge behind him, galloping with urgency, dust trailing behind in long, jagged lines. The rider shouted a name, the sound carrying through the streets, and the town collectively froze as recognition and dread passed through their faces. Aaron's jaw tightened as he turned slightly to watch the figure approach. He knew that the secrets he had come to uncover would not wait patiently for explanation. Reckoning had arrived, and the town would either meet it with courage or crumble beneath the weight of its own lies. And as the rider came closer, the realization sank into every soul in Dry Creek. The man who had vanished all those years ago was back. Not for forgiveness, not for peace, but for truth. The first choice he made, the first word he spoke, would set the tone for a confrontation the town had been avoiding for over a decade. A reckoning that would stir old guilt, old fear, and force the people to face what they had long tried to bury. Aaron, standing tall despite the years, waited patiently for the storm that was coming. He knew that in this quiet moment before history collided with the present, every step, every glance, and every word would carry the weight of lives lost, reputations shattered, and the fragile hope that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. The dust settled, the rider drew nearer, and the story of Dry Creek was about to be rewritten. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tailies from the frontier. We'll see you in the next one. The rider's horse stumbled as it skidded to a halt in the dusty center of Dry Creek. Foam flecked its neck and sides, its breath heaving as if it had outrun something far more menacing than mere distance. Every pair of eyes in town, once fixed on Aaron Whitlock, now shifted to the messenger. His face was a pale mask beneath a layer of grime. He slid from the saddle, his voice strained with urgency. Riders from Red Hollow, he warned, were already on their way, armed and burning with purpose. They'd heard the news. Aaron was back. Back in the very town that had cast him out years ago, shrouded in suspicion and fear. The name Red Hollow rippled through the crowd like a cold wind. Everyone knew what it stood for. It was wealth born from ashes, influence built on quiet intimidation. And it was Thomas Bragg, the man who had once called Aaron a brother before turning against him, his testimony sealing Aaron's fate when the Bitter Creek fire consumed more than just timber and cattle. Sheriff Callahan stepped forward, his posture calm but his presence resolute. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady. The rider swallowed hard. "At least 6, he answered. "Riding hard, carrying rifles and tempers sharpened by old grudges." A low murmur spread through the onlookers. Townsfolk exchanged uncertain glances, their whispers carrying on the dry air. Some said Aaron should leave before sunset, to spare the town from bloodshed. Others, their gazes dropping to the ground, remembered that night years ago. They remembered the accusations flying faster than facts, and how they had stood by and watched as a good man's reputation burned to the ground, never once stepping forward to question it. Aaron stood motionless near the water trough, his hands relaxed at his sides, betraying none of the turmoil within. But inside, memories stirred the acrid smell of smoke, the chaos of shouting, and the piercing image of Thomas Bragg standing before a crowd, his words dripping with venom. Betrayal, he had claimed. Theft. He had accused Aaron of setting the blaze himself to cover up missing funds. But the real truth, the one that had been smothered by lies, lay hidden in a ledger, buried deep beneath the charred floorboards of his own barn. He hadn't returned for revenge. He had returned for that ledger. It was still there. He knew it, wrapped and sealed, preserved beneath the soil that had kept his secret safe for a decade. If he could just get to it before Red Hollow silenced him for good, Dry Creek would finally see what fear had blinded them to all those years ago. Sheriff Callahan's voice cut through his thoughts, plain and direct. "What do you intend to do, Aaron?" The answer came without a flicker of hesitation. "I'm riding to Bitter Creek before sundown. I'm going to retrieve what's mine." What was his wasn't just a book of numbers, it was proof. Proof that the fire had been a calculated act of destruction, set to destroy records of fraudulent land seizures orchestrated by Bragg and his cronies. It was proof that Aaron had been framed, a convenient scapegoat to protect powerful men and their stolen empire. The sheriff studied him, his gaze sharp, weighing the immediate risk of a violent confrontation against the heavier, lingering burden of a decade of silence. Something in Aaron's eyes, a quiet fire of conviction, seemed to convince him. This was no longer just about one man's tarnished reputation, it was about the very soul of the town. As distant shapes began to materialize on the horizon, dark figures cutting sharp lines against the fading light, Sheriff Callahan made a decision that surprised even himself. He ordered several deputies to stand guard at the edge of town. Then he spoke, his voice not loud or dramatic, but carrying through the charged air with a quiet authority. Dry Creek would not hand over a man without hearing the full truth. One by one, the townspeople stepped forward. They didn't draw weapons. Their strength was in their presence. It was the first act of collective courage they had shown in 10 years, a silent apology and a promise. Aaron mounted his horse with steady hands, meeting the sheriff's gaze in a moment of silent gratitude. He turned his horse toward the road leading to the blackened ruins of Bitter Creek, knowing that time was slipping through his fingers like sand. Behind him, the Red Hollow riders approached at a measured, confident pace. Thomas Bragg was at their front, his posture radiating arrogance, his eyes fixed on the man he thought he had erased from history. As Aaron rode out of Dry Creek, the setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows behind him. The wind kicked up dust from the plains, like the turning of a page in a story long delayed. Every hoofbeat thundering toward Bitter Creek was a step closer to one of two outcomes: redemption or final, absolute ruin. If that ledger had survived the inferno, the truth would rise from the ashes with it. But if the fire had consumed it, then Aaron Whitlock would stand alone against the very men who had already proven how far they would go to protect their ill-gotten power. The last light of day stretched across the land as the riders from Red Hollow reached the edge of town, just as Aaron disappeared over a distant rise. The stage was set. The confrontation that was about to unfold would decide, once and for all, whether Dry Creek would remain a town ruled by fear, or finally become a town brave enough to face what it had done. Thanks for watching. Aaron rode hard toward the blackened skeleton of Bitter Creek Ranch. Twilight stretched across the plains in long bands of copper and violet, and the wind pressed against him as if testing whether his resolve would hold through one more trial. Behind him, the faint echo of distant hoofbeats reminded him that Thomas Bragg would not allow this search to happen uncontested. The land seemed unchanged despite the years. The same broken fence posts leaned at tired angles, the same shallow creek cut through dry earth. Yet everything felt heavier now because the past was no longer memory, but reckoning. When he reached the charred remains of the barn, he dismounted slowly, tying his horse to a scorched beam that had somehow survived the flames. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the silence settle into his chest. He remembered the laughter that once echoed between these walls, his father's steady voice teaching him that a man's name is worth more than his land. That name had been dragged through ash and accusation, but tonight, he intended to lift it back into the light. He knelt near the foundation stones, brushing aside hardened soil and brittle weeds with patient hands. He was aware that every second mattered, aware that riders from Red Hollow were drawing nearer with each breath he took. The oilcloth bundle had been sealed beneath a loose plank he had wedged into place the night before he fled. His fingers searched carefully until at last they struck something firm beneath the earth. His heart pounded not with fear, but with fragile hope as he unearthed the wrapped ledger and pulled it free, dirt falling away like the last layer of doubt. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, as though offering a silent prayer that truth had survived where trust had not. When he unwrapped the oilcloth and flipped open the cover, the inked pages greeted him like witnesses waiting to speak. They detailed forged land transfers, falsified debts, and the unmistakable signature of Thomas Bragg beside transactions that would have ruined families who could neither read nor defend themselves. Relief moved through Aaron slowly, steady as dawn. But the moment was cut short by the sound of approaching horses circling the clearing. Thomas Bragg emerged first from the shadows, flanked by his men. Their rifles rested casually, yet deliberately, across their saddles. His expression was controlled but tightened by calculation. "I was hoping the fire took everything," Bragg said calmly, dismounting with deliberate grace. "But I suppose you were always stubborn." Aaron rose to his full height, the ledger held firmly against his chest, and met the gaze of the man who had once shared meals at his table. "You burned more than wood that night," Aaron replied evenly. "You burned your own honor." Bragg's smile flickered, not in amusement but in warning. His men shifted subtly, forming a quiet perimeter. "You should have stayed gone," Bragg said. Dry Creek made its choice. Aaron shook his head slightly. "No," he answered. Dry Creek was afraid. Before another word could be exchanged, the thunder of additional hooves broke across the clearing. Both men turned to see Sheriff Callahan riding at the head of several townsfolk. They weren't armed for war but present in solidarity. Clara the baker was there, the blacksmith, farmers whose lands had quietly changed hands years ago. All were watching with eyes that carried regret and awakening. Sheriff Callahan dismounted and stepped forward, his badge catching the last sliver of dying sunlight. "We've come to hear the truth," he declared, his voice steady and unyielding. The clearing grew still. The only movement was the restless shifting of horses and the faint whistle of evening wind through burnt beams. Aaron opened the ledger and began reading. Names, dates, sums stolen through deception. Each word landed like a hammer striking old iron. As the reality unfolded before them, murmurs of disbelief gave way to anger not at Aaron but at the man standing opposite him. Bragg's confidence faltered under the weight of written proof. Though his hand hovered near his revolver, he seemed to understand that violence would only confirm his guilt before witnesses who were no longer willing to look away. For a long moment, no one moved, as though the plains themselves waited to see whether blood or courage would decide the outcome. It was Sheriff Callahan who broke the silence. He stepped between the two men and stated clearly that Dry Creek would not permit intimidation to silence truth again. The declaration wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The strength behind it came from the townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder, their fear finally replaced by resolve. Bragg studied the faces before him. He recognized that the power he once wielded had depended entirely on isolation, on keeping men divided and uncertain. Now that unity stood against him like an unbroken fence. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back, signaling his men with a subtle gesture that the fight he expected would not unfold tonight. Even a powerful rancher knows when the tide has turned. "This isn't over," he said quietly, though the threat sounded weaker than intended. Aaron met his gaze without flinching. "It is," he answered. "Because the truth doesn't burn." As Bragg mounted his horse and rode away into deepening dusk, his riders following in uneasy silence, the clearing felt lighter, as though something long buried had finally been unearthed and exposed to air. Sheriff Callahan placed a steady hand on Aaron's shoulder, not as an officer, but as a man acknowledging wrongs that could no longer be denied. The townsfolk stood quietly, understanding that redemption is not granted in a single moment, but begins with the courage to admit failure. The stars emerged one by one above Bitter Creek. Aaron looked out across the land that had once defined him, no longer with bitterness but with quiet peace. He knew that his father's name, his own honor, and the dignity of families wronged would no longer live in shadow. As they rode back toward Dry Creek together beneath a sky washed clean by twilight, the town no longer seemed like a place of exile, but of second chances. Aaron understood that while fire had once taken everything from him, it had also forged something stronger in its place. A man who returns not with vengeance but with truth leaves behind more than cleared accusations. He leaves behind the reminder that even in the dust of the frontier, justice can rise, steady and unyielding, like the sun after the longest night. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more tales from the heart of the Old West. We'll see you in the next one.